On January 19, 2026, police officers descended into the basement of a private home in Helsinki and discovered a person who had spent roughly 20 years in that windowless space. No light, no proper way out. And to understand why this story sent shockwaves across the country, you first need to understand where exactly it happened. Finland has topped global rankings for years. Quality of life, safety, trust in government – these aren't just talking points here, they're a functioning system. Kela, the National Social Insurance Agency, covers every resident in the country. Pensions, healthcare, housing, everything is linked into a single chain. 1 in 3 retirees receives a national pension, and the guaranteed minimum is roughly €990 per month. A person over 65 simply cannot vanish here. The system is designed to see everyone. And that's precisely why the tip didn't come from neighbors or through an anonymous call. One government agency passed the information to another through internal channels. It concerned a private home in the northern part of the city, an ordinary residential area, nothing that would stand out from the outside. Officers responded, entered the house, and went downstairs. And from this moment begins a story that would force the entire country to ask how something like this could possibly happen here. Concrete, dampness, silence, not a single window, no toilet, no shower, no sink, no stove, not even a place where someone could heat up food. And in this space there was a man, visibly around 80 years old. His condition was severe. He could barely move and needed not a checkup or a consultation, but immediate help. Officers called paramedics right away. The man was carefully brought upstairs and handed over to social and medical services. As the Helsinki police would later confirm, after receiving care, his condition was stabilized and he gradually began to recover. But at that moment, on January 19th, when they first laid eyes on him, he looked as though he had spent not days, not weeks, but far longer in that room. And here's another important detail. From the outside, the villa raised absolutely no questions. An ordinary private house in a residential neighborhood, neighbors on both sides. No suspicious odors, no noise, not a single complaint over all that time. No one living nearby had noticed anything unusual. Everything looked completely normal, right up until the moment they went downstairs. And then the investigation faced a question that would determine the entire course of the case. How long exactly had this person spent in a basement without light, air, and without basic conditions for survival? Preliminary findings gave the first number, and it wasn't weeks or months, it was approximately 20 years. This person had spent roughly 2 decades in that basement. The case was led by Detective Inspector Jari Karkkainen. In a statement to the press, he called this an exceptional case even by the standards of Finnish police, who had simply never encountered anything like it. 20 years in a space entirely unfit for human habitation. And all of this in a country where the government is legally obligated to know where every elderly person lives and how they're doing. And then came what few had expected. Helsinki police opened the case not as one of mistreatment or neglect, but specifically as a case of human trafficking. The wording was firm and specific: exploitation of a dependent position, confinement in conditions degrading to human dignity, and most likely financial gain for those who were nearby. The investigation immediately set its direction. Someone had used this person, not simply forgotten, not simply failed to help, used him systematically over the course of years. And from this point, the investigation faced its central question: who exactly had been living upstairs in this house all that time while he remained below? Police detained 3 individuals, 2 men and 1 woman, all around 60 years old, all Helsinki residents. According to the investigation, they were a married couple and their relative. Among themselves, family. Between them and the man from the basement, no blood relation whatsoever. The villa where he was found belonged to one of the detained men. And here's what's interesting: all 4 were registered at that address. On paper, everything looked normal. 4 people living in one house. Address exists, registration checks out. Nobody had any questions. But investigators fairly quickly established a detail that significantly changed the picture. The suspects did not live in the house permanently. They came and went. They showed up but didn't stay. What exactly they did during those visits and how often they actually appeared, that still remained to be determined. But the fact remained. The upstairs was empty, while downstairs there was a person who never went outside. During their detention, according to Karkanen, all three behaved calmly, cooperated with the investigation, and even expressed surprise that any of this was considered unlawful. And then something happened that raised questions for many. Shortly after their interrogations, they were released. Suspicions were not dropped, but they were released for the duration of the investigation. The investigator shared a detail with the press that didn't fit the usual logic of such cases. When the suspects were informed of the allegations, all three, in his words, were in shock. None of them requested a lawyer. None refused to answer questions. They didn't go silent, didn't shut down, didn't ask for time to think. They answered openly, calmly, like people with nothing to hide, or like people who were absolutely certain they had done nothing wrong. And at this moment, the investigation found itself at a fork that would determine the entire direction of the case. Option 1. These people had kept a man in a basement for 20 years and genuinely did not consider it unlawful. For them, it was normal, some sort of everyday arrangement, a habit that had stretched on so long it simply stopped seeming abnormal. Option 2. This was a carefully constructed line of defense, a role rehearsed in advance or switched on by instinct. We didn't know anything. We didn't do anything. We're just as surprised as you are. Police did not disclose which of these scenarios was their working theory, but the direction of the investigation had already been made clear: finances. Police identified financial gain as the central question, not a secondary motive, not an add-on to the charges, but the core of the entire case. Had the suspects exploited this person's dependent position to profit from him? And from there, the math turned out to be fairly straightforward. The guaranteed pension in Finland is roughly €990 per month. That's the minimum anyone receives who has no other pension income. If this man had any employment history, the amount could have been higher. But even at the lowest estimate, €990 multiplied by 12 months, multiplied by 20 years, that's approximately €240,000, $250,000, and that money went somewhere. Someone received it. Someone managed it. A person who spent 2 decades in a windowless room without basic living conditions was unlikely to have been spending it on himself. Officially, he was registered at the address. Officially alive, in the system, pension being paid without interruption. But who was withdrawing it? Where was it going? Who had access to the accounts? That's exactly what the investigation is now digging into. On paper, the mechanism could have looked flawless: address, recipient, payments. The system had no questions, but police now had an entirely different question. Was he receiving his pension, or had he ever even seen a single euro of it? Karkanen told journalists a phrase that shifted the entire understanding of the case. "We are currently determining whether he had the ability to leave the premises or not." Not a statement. Police themselves did not know the answer. And here's the thing. He wasn't found in chains. There were no locks on the doors. Nothing that typically comes to mind when you think of captivity. No bars, no ropes, no visible signs of physical restraint whatsoever. The classic image of confinement simply didn't apply here. That's precisely what made this case so difficult for investigators. When he ended up in that basement, he was around 60. At that point, he could walk, climb stairs, step outside without trouble. Physically, he was capable. But 20 years later, police found a man of approximately 80, in serious condition, requiring immediate assistance. And between those 2 points lies an enormous distance. And somewhere along it, a door that technically remained open at some point ceased to be an exit. What exactly kept him there, the investigation has not yet determined. Physical frailty, complete dependence on those who brought food, the absence of any outside contacts, or perhaps all of it combined. Slowly, year after year, layer upon layer. But if he wasn't held there by force, then the next question arose: how did he end up in that basement in the first place? Police did not release his name, surname, exact age, or nationality. The official explanation: considerations of confidentiality and the victim's safety. Here is what was known at that point. A man of approximately 80, long acquainted with the three suspects, but not connected to them by blood. No profession, no biography, not a single detail that would help understand who he was before that basement, where he came from, what he did, and whether he had anyone at all. Here begins a silence that speaks for itself. Not a single person came to the police and said, "I'm looking for him." No relative, no former partner, no colleague, no neighbor from a past life. Nobody filed a missing person report. Nobody raised the alarm. Most likely, by the time he moved into that house, he was already alone. In all probability, no close family remained, because otherwise, 20 years of complete silence would be quite difficult to explain. And by all indications, he belonged to the kind of person whose disappearance simply has no one to notice it. Not homeless, not marginalized, just a person without connections, without anyone who would at some point ask, "Where is he?" And most likely, that is precisely what made him vulnerable. Not age, not weakness, but isolation. But the fact that between him and complete disappearance from society's view, there was not a single living person. But in Finland, that is exactly what the government is supposed to be for. Kela is not just a pension fund. It's a state apparatus that administers virtually everything: pensions, health insurance, care allowances, medication reimbursements. Every resident of Finland who has lived in the country for at least 3 years automatically enters this system after the age of 65, not upon request, by the mere fact of existing. But Kela is only the first layer. Next come the municipalities. By law, they are responsible for providing social and medical services to every resident within their territory. A person with deteriorating health falls directly under their responsibility. There is a dedicated care allowance for retirees with chronic conditions, funding to support daily living. There is a housing allowance for those with low income. And each of these mechanisms involves contact, applications, reviews, reassessments every 2 years. And this isn't just a statement on paper, it actually works. Approximately 116,000 people receive the guaranteed pension. Over 200,000 receive allowances. The system is built so that no elderly person is left without attention. Regular reviews, notifications, automatic adjustments. And all of this existed and functioned throughout the entire 20 years he spent in a windowless basement. Whether social or medical services ever visited him, not once in 20 years, not at any point whatsoever, journalists asked this question directly. No answer followed. And that silence itself is a signal. If there had been contact, if even one agency had ever gone to that address and seen this person, the investigation would most likely have mentioned it, if only to show that the system had tried. And from here, it becomes clear how this was even possible. Finland's entire social safety net operates on an application-based principle. Kela pays the pension, but doesn't verify how the recipient actually lives. The municipality is legally obligated to help, but if no one reaches out to them, they don't come on their own. The care allowance exists, but it has to be requested. Housing allowance reviews happen, but based on paperwork, not home visits. Every element of this system waits for an incoming signal, and a person in a windowless basement cannot send one. He won't walk into an office. He won't call the municipality. He won't fill out a form on Omakela. And so, from the database's perspective, everything looked perfectly routine. Address exists, recipient is alive, payments are going through, no complaints, no inquiries. Everything's in order. The system worked exactly as it was designed. It simply wasn't designed for someone who cannot ask for help on their own. On January 19, 2026, after 20 years of complete silence, the signal finally reached the police. And it came not from neighbors, not from relatives, not from Kela. The Helsinki police press release stated briefly, the information was received from another government agency. The person who raised the alarm explained that they had come to know the victim through their work. Who they are is not disclosed. Name, position, agency, all withheld. But the fact itself speaks volumes. This was someone who, in the course of their duties, ended up nearby. Possibly a social worker, a medical professional, someone who saw this person and understood that what was happening was not normal. Police acted within 24 hours. They arrived, entered the house, went downstairs, and brought him out. The entire state apparatus, Kayla, the municipality, the pension system, medical services, did not send a single signal in 2 decades. But one person who simply encountered him through their work did what the system failed to do. The man was removed from the basement and placed under the care of the appropriate services. And then one question remained. What happens to him now? Human trafficking in Finland is not new, but until this moment, it was always someone else's story. Berry pickers from Thailand working without contracts and without any rights, women brought into the country under the promise of marriage, migrant construction workers on off-the-books terms. Nearly half of all identified cases involved labor exploitation. Another quarter involved sexual exploitation. And the number of identified victims had been rising, from 229 in 2019 to 367 in 2022. The profile was almost always the same: a foreigner, a person without documents, without the language, without connections. The U.S. State Department consistently placed Finland in its top tier, Tier 1. Formally, the country was doing everything right. But in June 2024, the Council of Europe's expert group GRITA released a report. Too few convictions. Investigations that dragged on, some for more than 4 years. Criminal proceeds were virtually never confiscated. Compensation for victims was not guaranteed. In 2024, the courts handed down just 4 convictions in trafficking cases, 4 for the entire country. And now a case had emerged that didn't fit any familiar template at all. Not a foreigner, an elderly Finn. In the capital, in a private house. 20 years, the house stood in an ordinary residential area. On paper, 4 residents. In practice, the upstairs was empty. The 3 registered occupants came by from time to time, but didn't actually live there. The only permanent inhabitant of the house was downstairs, in a space without windows. And here you need to understand how the system itself works. In Finland, a registered address isn't just a line in a database, it's the point of attachment for everything else. Through it, Kayla determines where to send payments. Through it, the municipality knows who lives within its territory. Through it, medical services know which health center a person is assigned to. Address exists, person exists. No inquiries, no problem. And here's what it all comes down to. The registration made this house look like a perfectly ordinary household. If anyone from Kela or the municipality had decided to check, and such checks as would later emerge most likely were never conducted, they would have seen a registered resident with a valid address. No grounds for concern. Pension being disbursed, address on file, no complaints. And so the registration, which by design was supposed to protect him, to ensure access to his pension, to health care, to support, in practice functioned as a shield, but not for him, for those who wanted this entire situation to remain invisible. Kärkkäinen confirmed to the press something that perhaps no one expected. According to the investigation, the man had moved into this house voluntarily, on his own, more than 20 years ago. No one brought him, no one lured him. There was no deception, no threats, no coercion of any kind. He knew these people, they knew him, and he came to live in the basement of this house. He was around 60 at the time. In all likelihood, he could move freely without assistance, made his own decisions, and fully understood where he was going and to whom. It was a deliberate choice by an adult, and at this point, the entire framework a viewer might have been building in their mind begins to collapse. This is not a story about abduction, not a story about imprisonment, not a story about someone with locks on the door. The man came on his own, and he stayed 1 year, 5, 10, 20, until, quote, 3, quote, gradually turned into, quote, 4, quote, and where exactly that line was crossed, the investigation has not yet established. Was there a moment when he wanted to leave but physically no longer could? Or did he simply stop wanting to? Because after 20 years in a windowless room, there's no more left of one's will than there is of one's health? That is precisely what made this case so complex. Not for the investigation, but for understanding. There was no abduction. There was no single moment when freedom ended with one click. There was a slow, years-long transformation of a voluntary decision into a trap. Most likely, in the beginning, it looked like a way out. A man with nowhere to live, acquaintances offering a room. Downstairs, in the basement, not ideal, but there's a roof. A temporary solution, except the temporary rather quickly became permanent, and the permanent became inescapable. And with each passing year, the person who could have opened that door found it increasingly difficult to climb the stairs. And here's how this mechanism actually worked. The house wasn't his. The money, most likely, wasn't his either. Contact with the outside world, zero. The people he depended on for food came and went. He stayed. The system saw an address, a registration, a payment. A living person gradually became a line item, one that reliably generated disbursements but required no attention. And suddenly, the suspect's shock receives an entirely different explanation. Perhaps in their worldview, everything really was normal. He came on his own. They didn't throw him out. Technically, everything was legal. The room has no windows and no toilet. Well, he never complained. The investigation continues. Charges have not yet been filed, but one person has already walked out of a basement for the first time in 20 years, in a country where, on paper, everything works perfectly. Let us know what you think about this video, leave a like, and subscribe to our channel. See you next time.